and a stunning admission from the Israeli military about the killing of 3 hostages in Gaza by Israeli troops. We're now learning that the 3 men were holding up a white flag before they were shot. A preliminary investigation has found that at least 1 soldier thought they were militants, and the revelations adding more fuel to a nation's outrage over a deadly mistake. The scene in Tel Aviv last night as people took to the streets to call on the government to secure a new hostage release deal. More than 20 of the nearly 240 people kidnapped by Hamas and taken into Gaza on October the 7th are now believed to be dead. For more on the situation in Israel, we've reached Avi Meir. He's the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Avi, good to see you again.
Thank you very much, Tasha.
Avi, it's just yesterday, but already so much has developed and changed and so many comments have come out. Take me back to the moment in Israel when the news was confirmed that, in fact, 3 Israeli hostages had been killed by members of the IDF.
Well, Natasha, this is obviously an extremely tragic moment here in Israel. We know that well over 100 hostages are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. We don't know what their status is. We don't know, in fact, how many of them are still alive. Here were 3 who were, in fact, alive until that tragic error yesterday when an Israeli soldier mistakenly identified them as terrorists, opened fire, and 3, in fact, were killed. There has been an investigation, as your introduction said, in which it was revealed that they were actually shirtless. They were carrying a white flag. And the IDF has said that the soldiers opened fire in contravention of the protocols and the rules of engagement. Obviously, there'll be a deeper investigation, and there'll be an effort to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again.
But as you say, Avi, some of these details, even for the most hawkish amongst us, would be very, very disturbing. The fact that they were shirtless, the fact that there was a white flag being waved, that there was the words help and SOS spray painted on the exterior walls, that they reportedly screamed help to the soldiers in Hebrew. I mean, all of this. And in fact, the IDF also found a message saying 3 hostages need help on those buildings 2 days before that deadly attack. How do you make such a brutal mistake when everything about that causes the soldier to say, I need to pause and assess the situation?
It's important to understand the environment in which this combat is taking place. This is a highly built-up urban environment, and Hamas has been known to use decoys to attempt to mislead soldiers, in fact, into doing exactly this kind of thing. We know that there have been times in which terrorists have hidden amongst civilians. They do it as a matter of course. They often disguise themselves as civilians. If you look at the casualty counts in Gaza, according to the Hamas Ministry of Health, all of the casualties were civilians because they, in fact, do not identify terrorists as such. And so one can somewhat understand how an Israeli soldier might be misled into thinking that someone was one thing when, in fact, he was another. But, of course, this was a tragic, tragic error, and the military do whatever it can to ensure it never happens again.
What have we heard from the families of these 3 men who died?
Well, of course, they're deeply, deeply saddened. They are calling for an investigation. I think all of the hostage families are calling for re-intensified efforts to ensure that there can be a deal to bring as many of those hostages home. We know that even before this event took place, there were negotiations taking place between the head of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, and the Qatari prime minister in Europe in an effort to reach yet another deal that would see the release of Israeli hostages in return for Palestinian terrorists being held in Israeli prisons. There are many Israelis who hope that that deal does in fact go forward and that as many of those hostages can in fact be brought home.
Is the support for the war wavering at all in Israel?
I don't think it is. I think there's a very broad recognition that in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, in which 1,200 Israelis were murdered by Hamas, an effort needs to be undertaken to ensure that Hamas can never undertake an effort like that ever again. And so that is something that has galvanized Israeli support from both the right and the left. The government and the opposition are united in this effort. But of course, Israelis at the same time want to ensure that those hostages, those 100 plus people, are brought home safely, as many of them as possibly can. So that, I think, are two efforts that we see coalescing in the Israeli consciousness, and there's broad Israeli support for both.
Avi, let me ask you this. It's a comment that I've been hearing a lot in the past 24 hours, which is more Israeli hostages were freed in that week-long truce. It was a temporary truce, but more people got out, back to their families, safe and sound, and in this recovery process than in the 2+ months of warfare. So clearly the truce and the ability to just put down arms, even for a few days, has worked better for the hostages and the immeasurable suffering of people in Israel waiting for their loved ones to come back than the war is. How is Netanyahu or the IDF responding to that?
Well, in the Israeli understanding, it was actually the military effort that enabled those hostage releases to happen. What we understand is that Hamas understands pressure. Hamas understands military pressure in particular, and that it was not so inclined to release any hostages until Israel came down hard on Hamas, on its military infrastructure, and did whatever it could to ensure that they were in fact being released. And so that, I think, is what we see happening. That is what many Israelis understand is the point of this military effort, at least in part, to ensure that as many hostages as are released as possibly can be.
Okay. Avi, we might have lost your image, but we can still hear you. So we'll keep going with the conversation if it's okay with you.
Sure.
You mentioned that these are some of the tactics that are used by Hamas to... Oh, we've got your back. Great. So we were talking about the writing on the wall and the flying of the white flag, and these are tactics used by Hamas to lure in Israeli soldiers and to possibly kill them or hurt them. But then the other question becomes, how many actual Palestinian civilians might have been doing the same thing, might have been waving white flags? And if ordinary Israelis were confused for Palestinian Hamas members, then imagine how many ordinary Palestinian civilians would have been confused potentially for Hamas fighters, and they were killed. Is the IDF at all taking into account that, yeah, we don't know, and we're kind of killing whoever comes in the path, even though we've told them to leave?
Well, look, we actually have clear evidence of many scores of Palestinians surrendering and handing down arms. We have, in fact, photographs. Israel has been criticized for publicizing those photographs of many dozens of Palestinians, including terrorists, laying down their arms and surrendering to the IDF. So we know that that does happen, and the IDF does, of course, maintain international law and international humanitarian law when it comes to the treatment of those who do surrender. This, of course, was a tragic, tragic event, a huge error, and the Israeli military will do whatever it can to ensure it never happens again.
How do things move forward in terms of an investigation, and what does accountability look like?
Well, it will be an internal investigation conducted by the IDF. There's a military police force that engages in ensuring that these sort of incidents are indeed investigated and that protocols are put in place to ensure that they never happen again. So I imagine that that's what we'll see in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, it's just a terrible story. Feel terrible for those families. Avi Meir, thank you so much for shining a light for us.